Good afternoon.
Hi.
How are you?
Very good. Very good.
Long time no see.
Yeah.
It is
Yeah.
good to see you. So,
Good to see you.
thank you so much. May I ask you please to tell us your name and share anything about yourself you feel comfortable sharing?
Benjamin Reese. Currently, I'm the president and CEO of a global diversity and inclusion company called Ben Reese LLC. And I'm adjunct professor in a couple of departments at Duke University. And I've been working across the country and internationally, now all via Zoom or WebEx. But prior to the virus, I was traveling around the world and lecturing and teaching and facilitating workshops, and this has been my life's work.
Yeah, and I will say I met you at Duke, and the work that you have done there is just outstanding. You know, you left an incredible mark. I saw you talk at the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce, but what I remember most about you is the story you tell about how you got started. You know, from New York to North Carolina, your story, and it's such an amazing story. May I ask you to share a little bit about that?
Yeah. Sure. So when I was 5 years old, my family moved from Harlem, New York, you know, back then an all-black neighborhood, to the Bronx near Yankee Stadium, which at that time was an all-white neighborhood. And so I had let's say, an interesting upbringing there. By the time I got into high school, I was spending a lot of time, not in class, but on picket lines, sit-ins, demonstrations, etc. And my parents, who had just finished high school and were just incredibly supportive to me, told me almost daily that I needed to get a college education, but they didn't really know what that meant. They just knew I had to do it. So by the time I graduated high school, you know, not going to class, participating in demonstrations, I had probably a C+ average. Knew I had to go to college, but I didn't know anything about it. So I applied to some Ivy League schools, some state schools, some community colleges, and every place turned me down. But I was able to start at Bronx Community College as a part-time student. I didn't have the grades to go full-time, but I started as a part-time student. But probably the more important reason I was able to start my college education was because, believe it or not, there was no tuition in the New York City university system, including Bronx Community College. So I started my college education taking 2 classes, paying, I think, about $40 a semester in fees, but no tuition. And my family, you know, we were challenged economically, so I was helping out by working part-time. After that first semester, the governor of New York State, Governor Rockefeller, said he was going to impose $15 or $20 a credit for the first time. I didn't know how I would afford that. And being in my protest mode, I got together with some of my colleagues from some of the other city university schools. We got our sleeping bags, went on the New York City subway, went to the governor's office in Manhattan, put our sleeping bags out on the concrete, and we vowed to sleep there in protest until he changed his mind about imposing tuition for the first time. He ignored us, but we did get a lot of press coverage. And so the photograph from the New York Post newspaper from March of 1965 has been with me over these 50+ years. And I look back at that sleep-in demonstration as really the first time I co-led a kind of action on behalf of access to higher education and issues of diversity, really my first leadership role. And so over the 50+ years of doing this work, I've tried to stay true to those values and to make the contributions to this planet that I think are important in terms of social justice.
So,
And as you know, I
go ahead.
spent many years at Duke as the vice president overseeing diversity, equity, inclusion for the undergraduate campus, the 9 graduate and professional schools, and then the health system of 3 hospitals and clinics. And prior to that, prior to coming to North Carolina, I was in New York City working, and I left 5 jobs to come to Duke.
Yeah.
I was in my 20th year of directing a large community mental health center, 80 and 90 psychiatrists, psychologists, et cetera. At the same time, I was in private practice, seeing adults in psychotherapy, people who were corporate executives, et cetera, and then people who could pay $2 or $3 a session. My third job, I was the ombudsperson for the Rockefeller Foundation. So I was the designated neutral trying to help them manage disputes related to race differences, cultural differences, gender differences, sexual orientation, et cetera. My fourth job, I was running my own institute called the Institute for the Study of Culture and Ethnicity. Then my fifth job, I was consulting to organizations and speaking across the country and abroad. In fact, my last consultant job that I left for my colleague to continue as I moved to North Carolina was a contract to try to impact the culture and climate of the New York Times in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, both the newspaper side of the Times and the corporate side. And so I moved to North Carolina 24 years ago, took the offer at Duke, and stepped down as vice president because I wanted to take these 50 years and in my remaining years of work, apply it to work with various types of organizations, higher education, corporations, not-for-profits, you name it, law firms, technology firms. I've been working with all kinds of organizations, trying to be helpful. So that's my journey.
So in your mind, how do you define diversity? What does diversity mean in plain speak?
Well, I think it's all of the ways in which we differ as humans: height, weight, complexion, language, etc. But I also recognize that all of those differences are certainly important, but they're not all equal.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for example, in the US culture, the focus on differences in eye color or height are just not as powerful as differences in race,
Right.
or complexion,
Right.
or religion. So I think diversity is about all of those differences and the kind of implications that they have for the way we live our lives.
Why do you think it is, coming from enslaved people through Jim Crow to Brown versus the Board of Education to these overt acts of racism, how is it possible that we are still continuing this fight? You know, why is this still such I'm sorry.
Your connection just went out for a moment.
So how do you think we came from enslaved people, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, to overt acts of racism today? How is this path still a viable thing? Why are we still so divergent from each other by simple things as race and gender?
Well, I think in the United States, a lot of the answers to those questions really emanate from the history of the enslavement of Black folks. That if we think and reflect on slavery as not so much what individuals or groups have done, but the ways in which that system structured inequity, And so I think at the very core of the United States, along with all of the positive things about this country, at the very core is inequity related to race. You know, starting from the moment that we were forcibly brought to this country.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and although the enslavement of people has happened all over the world in Greek and Roman time, and certainly in Africa and Europe, in the United States, there are some distinguishing aspects of the enslavement of Black folks. In addition to being based on politics and economics, in the United States, the enslavement of Black people was based on this notion that Black people weren't human, that Africans were really closer to animals. And so you have the development of this pseudoscience that said that Africans had thicker skin, fewer nerve endings, the cognitive portion of their brain was diminished. They suffered from diseases that prompted them to run away. They could endure pain differently from white people because they weren't fully human. And so if you think at the very core of this nation, the enslavement of Black people was not only a political, a financial issue, but a nation enslaved people because they believed they weren't human and they could be used. And so, you know, I think much of the answer to your questions about the struggles that we have now go to the structural and systemic way in which racism has existed in this nation.
Yeah. And unfortunately, there's a part of that, at least in my understanding, that we apply a lot of that to ourselves. You know, the olden times, when my parents were around, you had the paper bag thing, the texture of your hair,
Oh,
so
yeah.
it
Oh,
seems
yeah.
like we are always looking for a reason to separate people as opposed to uniting people, and as you described, people thinking of us as animals. I mean, the science does not support that, but the rationale that we have in society does. It makes sense that you could kill a Black man with your knee on his neck because he may or may have done something wrong. You must see him as an animal to do that, because you could not see him as a human being and do that.
Yeah. You're right.
And so one of the things that to me is really pertinent right now is the difference between the crack epidemic and the opioid methamphetamines epidemic, right? So when it was crack, the resolution was jail or whatever. Today, opioids and all the other things that are out there are considered sicknesses or mental illness. Is that also directly related to racism? Because there were more, and I think that's not even a true statement, there were more Black people doing crack, but the portrayal was that there was a lot of Black people doing crack. Why do you think there's such a difference between those two lenses?
Well, I think that really goes back to and is supported by structural and systemic racism. We see it in healthcare. Everything from the way you conceptualize an illness, whether it's related to a shortcoming of the person or whether you see it externally. And I think for a lot of Black people, the notion has been that an illness or a sickness is really part of their own shortcoming. We see health disparities in virtually every illness and disease, including COVID-19.
Right.
And so when we had the, quote, crack epidemic, it was conceptualized as this is a shortcoming, this is connected with the, illness, criminality of Black folks. And so it was treated as a crime as opposed to a health issue.
Right.
And you're right. You see you juxtapose that to the way cocaine is dealt with when it's used by white people. You see vividly the difference in the way you think about substance use and the way you respond to its use. You either lock people up or you send them to the hospital, depending on how you see them as people and what responsibility you think they have for a condition. Yeah.
So one of the pieces of that is massive incarceration, specifically of Black and brown people. So study after study after study tells us how much of the population we make up overall and how great that population is in the prison system. So, and if you pay attention to the law, majority of people are white police officers, white judges, white district attorneys, all of these people. And it's kind of hard to believe that people have no bias, you know, that they don't bring a bias to this. So if a Black man is seen running, do you automatically assume he's committed a crime? Or if the tail light is broken, has he stole someone's car? So is there, and I'm asking you more philosophically, is prison able to rehabilitate people, and is there a trauma from going to prison and coming out to reoffending again?
Well, there obviously is. If you think of prison in the United States, there are certainly countries, or some European countries, where prison is seen as a rehabilitation experience. And so people who've committed crimes are treated very different from the way they're treated in the United States. And the prison experience takes you away from society, and the goal is rehabilitation, as opposed to the goal, directly or indirectly, being punishment, degradation, and stripping you of a sense of humanity. But I see the incarceration of people and of African Americans as part of the systemic and structural racism context of the United States. You know, you think of some of the first, quote, police officers were members of the slave patrols who hunted down black folks who ran away, and by law could bring them back in any condition, without arms or legs or blinded,
whatever,
or dead, without any kind of punishment. So that was built into the law. And then after the formal end of slavery in 1865, you had a series of black codes that included things like any black person who wasn't working, didn't have a job, could be incarcerated. I mean, so that's just a continuation. And, you know, it was extremely difficult to get a job because there was such discrimination in those post-slavery years. And you had built into the Constitution in the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. It said you couldn't enslave anyone except if they were incarcerated. If they were prisoners, then you could make them work for nothing, which is basically enslavement.
Which we do.
So you take that up to today, you know, you're right. So today we see, of course, primarily black men in the prisons in the United States working for nothing, or $1 a day or $1.50 a day, in a situation that many see as modern day slavery.
Absolutely.
And so many of our corporations in America use products made by people who are essentially free labor. Absolutely. Black people.
Yep.
Who are providing free labor.
Yep.
So I trace the incarceration context of today back to the history of systemic and structural racism in our nation.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to get your thoughts on. So do you know who Michael Vick is? He played football.
Yeah.
So here was this successful football player, you know, great talent. Mm-hmm. And the people he associated with and I don't know whether he was directly involved with this dog thing, but there were people who wanted him to be executed for killing 7 or 8
Mm-hmm.
dogs. And I don't know if he actually killed those 7 or 8 dogs. And
Mm-hmm.
it seems to me that Black people, when they create the same crime as a white person, it becomes far greater that the Black person has done that.
Yeah.
And there was, in the Michael Vick story, there's a piece where a man had killed 3 people and gotten 7 years in prison. No one was hollering for him to be executed, but they were hollering for him to be executed because of dogs. And I grew up in the South. I was born up north in New York, but I grew up in the South. And chicken fights, dog fights, anything that would fight, they would get it together to fight. And it was sort of a form of entertainment. If you take that back to Roman times, they did the same thing with men, you know, the weaker, you know. So it seems like to me where Black people are in a situation where their behaviors are not what white people want them to be, are judged harshly. And I assume that's still related to this systemic and institutional racism talked about.
Yeah. I mean, regardless of how someone feels about dog fights or chicken fights, the reality based in hard data is that a Black person and a white person committing the same crime are not treated the same.
Absolutely.
Both in terms of the overt, clear bias and often in terms of the subtle unconscious bias. But it's well documented that in committing a crime, Black and white people are treated differently. The punishment is different.
Absolutely. So
and you know, and it's not only or so much related to the people, because we see Black officers sometimes committing the same crimes and promulgating the inequities that white officers do. It's really more about the structure and system.
Right. I think you're absolutely right about that. So I work in IT. I've been in IT for 40 plus years. It is 2020, and I am still sometimes the only person in these meetings.
Yeah.
I am not the CIO or the CTO or the person that's in charge. My experience of the people that I've interviewed over time that are CIOs, whatever it is, didn't even come close to my experience. But there's something about being Black, and even I'll go a step further, and female in leadership, right? So women, historically, women have struggled in leadership and all that. They're not recognized, you know, as leaders for whatever reason. But I did a talk for CLAC, which is the humanities colleges. I think there's 73 or 4 of them. And I was shocked to find out that out of 70 plus universities and colleges, there are only 3 Black people that are CIOs or leading their IT structure. And so the question that I'm often asked is, why is it that Black people and brown people are not hired into these positions? And my thought has always been, because you don't want to. It's just simply that you don't want to, because you often hear, well, we can't find qualified Blacks, we can't find this. And even at my university where I work now, no one recognizes the value I bring to my university. I'm supposed to go do my 40 hours and go home and sit down and be quiet and don't raise my voice, because if not, I'm being aggressive or passive aggressive or whatever name they want to call me, which justified the behavior for me on June 14th. Why is it that in these roles of leadership where people, Black and brown people, could have an opportunity to demonstrate what they can do, they're not given that opportunity? And does it relate directly back to systemic and institutional racism? Or is it that there's some presumption that the more people that look like me, the more productive we will be?
No, well, I think the basis is structural and systemic racism. Often the selection process is overtly and explicitly biased. And when it's not overtly and explicitly biased, it's often just riffed with unconscious bias. You know, there's a recent study I read within the week that said in the current environment, there is a fairly small difference in the entering salary of people in technology. once they get the job, the gap in both income and how high they get in the organization just continues to expand.
Right.
And so they enter more or less with the same, salary. But after that, I think all of the subtle and explicit biases within so many of our organizations results in lower salary and certainly few people at the top.
Absolutely.
And, this argument about it's all about the pipeline is, it's faulty. I
right.
mean, there's certainly a contribution to the pipeline, but in so many fields, the contribution isn't major.
Right.
You might say it's greater in some of the neurophysical areas, but in an area like technology, it's not like, there are no people in the field of technology.
Right.
One of the examples of that, I think, that punches a hole in this pipeline issue is that in the last 2 or 3 months, you can almost go to LinkedIn or other online sources, and you suddenly see Black people appointed to be vice president, vice chancellor, second in command in a tech company. And I'm saying to myself, so where were all of these people a month ago?
Right.
When people were saying it's all about the pipeline?
Yep.
How come you suddenly found them?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And that relates back to this white awareness that we have right now after Mr. Floyd's death. All of this is a bit mind-boggling. So, my history books told me that Christopher Columbus discovered America. My history books painted America that didn't exist in reality. But I was always aware that I was Black. I mean, I grew up where I was called the N-word so much, I thought it was my name because they said it so much. But when I talk to white people, specifically in this diversity chat format, they're saying I'm reading now, or I'm paying more attention, or I'm listening.
Yeah,
and even the thing about jobs, more and more people are saying, well, we need to bring more Black and brown people into leadership roles. But what you see is what we see on LinkedIn is those singular, one person is here, or one. It's not something that you've done universally. And I know you were at Duke a few years ago when we had the noose incident. President Broad had brought together a group of people, and I don't know if what the students said in that meeting was really acted upon. So one Asian woman stood up and said, I don't see anybody that looks like me that I can go to and share my thoughts. And Black people are saying, I'm afraid to walk between point A and point B at night, when my class ends. But yet still, and that is not unique to Duke. I think that's universal. All places suffer with some of this. But the fact that we don't recognize the value of Black and brown people and women to some degree in these organizations and leadership organizations, and the point you were talking about salary. So here I was, my counterpart and I worked in the exact same place. I had more experience, more education, more everything. And he made at least $40,000 more a year than I did. And no one thought there was anything was wrong with that. That was perfectly fine, because we don't want to uproar or dislodge the logic that we put in place of how these things should work. So I think that in a lot of ways, the work that you do and have done specifically at Duke really points out the failures in society to recognize the value of diversity. It's great to say that. It's great to hire a Black person if you've never hired one. In 2015, Google did their first pass at facial recognition software. And whenever it saw a person of a certain pigment, it put up a picture of a gorilla. Now, we know Google didn't do that intentionally. That would be bad business sense for them to do that, right? But they did that because they have all the people working on this project look just like white people. So no one even consciously thinks about, we need some brown people, or what happens if you see a brown person, right? So I think that, the work that you do and needs to continue to be done has got to be bringing people face to face with these realities, as opposed to having talking points about them or watching a movie or reading a book. we need concerted action. So my question to you are, with your private company and the work that you have done thus far, and I know you've talked to some amazing people. Like I said, I've seen you talk so many times. What are the things that you can do or bring to the table that may help people become more aware of these problems that we have in our society, specifically around race? You know, life and death is one thing, but even the most basic, you know, can I have some place to stay? Can I feed my family? Can I get my children to the doctor? What are the efforts that you are undertaking to kind of address that?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think part of what people are saying, particularly young people nowadays, are saying that in addition to sort of changing the face of people, which is important, representation is important, we really have to look at the systems and structures that have got us to this point, and the systems and structures that support the current inequities. So when I work with organizations, it's not only about, so what can you do to hire more women, more people of color, but it's more about what are the current processes that you have in place that perpetuate inequities. And so companies, you know, if they're going to be successful, have to be engaged with interrogating those issues around structure and process and be committed to changing things. I'm all in favor of hiring one more of these or two more of these, but we've really got to look at systems and structures. So you just mentioned Google, and let me tell you something. This has probably happened 4 days ago. So I'm preparing for a presentation, and I'm doing some PowerPoint slides on microaggressions. And one of the kind of cliches that people use to help people understand what microaggressions are, it's like 1,000 pinpricks. Now, you know, it's a word that someone uses or a look. And so people say it's like, you know, 1,000 pinpricks. So I want to put a picture on my slide on microaggressions. So I go into Google and I type in pinprick. All white people come up. Okay. So finger prick. All white people. So then I put in finger prick on a black person. And only about 6 or 7 black people come up. Still, they're all white. I said to myself, like, so what do I have to do? And, you know, it's, you know, these algorithms, I'm sure I don't think it's a person sitting down saying, let's not put any black finger in. Is that the systems, as you say, are based upon a segment of society. And so, you know, all of the AI work just constantly generates the biases and inequities in our society. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic that AI, facial recognition, et cetera, that those things in the future at some point are going to be useful. But we've got to somehow figure out how do you utilize that kind of technology in a way that isn't based on the current and historical inequities in our life, in our system. You know, if you're going to use it in the selection of employees, then often the data comes from who's been successful in the company.
Absolutely.
The people who've been successful have been primarily at the top white people. So if you use that data to build your AI system for recruitment, it's going to be biased. So I'm confident that cautiously confident that it's going to be helpful at some point, but we've got to, you know, as a society and certainly as a field of technology, figure out how do we use that technology and filter out kind of inherent historical and contextual bias.
Absolutely. I think it's got a long way to go, because the people it's only as good as the people that are developing it. And if you only have a certain group of people developing, you're going to continue to have bias and discrimination in even emerging technologies. I want to ask you, two more questions, and I'll give you some time
Yeah.
to talk. And I really would like you to talk a little bit about your company and how people can get in touch with you
Mhm.
if they want to
Yeah.
leave. So the first
Yeah.
thing is, so about 3 or 4 years ago, well, before this current person in the White House was elected, there was this mass about the graying and browning of America, right? So baby boomers and people other than whites that are growing exponentially in our society, right? So I'm a baby
Mhm.
boomer. And the article that was written, I believe it was written by someone at UNC, the one that I had read, something to the effect that 8 baby boomers are dying a day, 8 a day. And I think right now, if I remember correctly, baby boomers were the largest segment of the population at that time. I don't know if that's still true today. And then to further extrapolate that, the browning, where we have more Latinos, more Asians,
Mhm.
more all these
Mhm.
other coming into society. And with that, with those two things, the graying and browning, so as more of us die off, that historical
Mhm.
knowledge is lost. And with more brown people coming in, if they've never been given a seat at the table, how do
Right.
they know how to serve the meal?
Yeah. 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 You know, I do think that there are people at the middle management level, people of color, who do have the skills and competencies. But I think so often they don't get the opportunity to move to that highest level because of subtle unconscious bias,
Yes.
not seeing the Black person as being as skilled and competent because they may not have gone to one of the Ivy League schools.
Yeah.
They may not have had the traditional experiences. And so their resumes often look different. When they present who they've worked with, it's often different. Um, and it's not related to their particular skills and competencies. When I first came to Duke 24 years ago, uh, I was hired by a mentor of mine, Myrna Adams, a Black woman. And she said, people who I hire as assistant vice presidents at these kind of universities like Duke typically have gone to 2 or 3 or 4 different universities until they get up to the stature of Duke. And she said, you know, Ben, you've consulted to higher ed organizations around the world. You've consulted to other kinds of businesses around diversity and race for almost 50 years. You've never worked full-time in an institution. If I base it upon you going to, you know, the appropriate universities, then I miss out on what she saw as skills and competencies. So she hired me.
Yeah.
And so when she retired, you know, I became vice president. And now that I'm contributing to higher ed policy across the country, I reflect on the fact that I probably wouldn't have gotten in the door if it wasn't for this Black woman who saw skills and competencies that were framed in a non-traditional way.
Absolutely.
And so I've tried in my work to recognize talent and skills that can contribute to an organization, but may not come forward in a traditional way.
And I think to that, you know, there are coded words in our language that people don't realize the impact of
Mm-hmm.
those words. So, you know, if you hear in an interview or something, we're looking for a high level executive or a C-level executive. Now, if you took it in plain speak, it's just, they're just looking for a leader, right? But the way they frame it, it becomes a word that almost eliminates anyone that's not white, and mostly white and male.
Yeah.
In my industry, we have terms such as whitelisting and blacklisting, right? So this is whether you let a website come on your whitelisting and blacklisting. So if it's a whitelist, it's great. If it's a blacklist, it's bad. You have slave and master to describe a computer and its hard drive. You know, you've got all these terms that are prevalent in our language and used so often, and no one seems to be bothered by them. No one seems to care about these things. So if you are going to hire a C-level or senior level person and you look around and everybody around you is white, you have a problem. and I don't care what company you are, I don't care how successful, you could make $1 gazillion an hour. As sooner or later, if you don't diversify your actions, your ideas, your persons, and your thoughts, that company is going to fall apart. And, you know, if you want to sell only to white supremacists, I'm sure there's a market and you will do very well to that. But Black people and brown people contribute almost $30 billion a year to the American economy. Why aren't we there? Why aren't we included? We can buy it, but we can't make it. We can show it, but we can't teach it. Why? You know, and you know, I'm just so grateful that you chatted with me, but I really do want you to tell us about your company now and how people can contact you.
Oh, sure.
And,
Sure.
and what are you looking for? So thank you.
So first, if you Google Ben Reese and implicit bias, you'll find, you know, bunches of stuff online that I've done around the country and internationally. My email address is BD for David, BD Reese Jr. @gmail.com. And Reese is REESE. So BD Reese Jr. @gmail.com. And as I said, my company works with virtually every type of organization. You know, I certainly currently I'm in the midst of evaluating the diversity, equity, inclusion work at 2 universities, one a major university in the Midwest, and another one a small elite college in California. I'm working with a technology firm. Last week, I did a presentation for the Board of Regents of one of our southern states. So this is the 20 plus people who run the public education system, higher ed system, along with the chancellor of the system, along with all of the people in senior positions in the office, and then the 12 college and university presidents in this state. I have 2 law firms that I'm currently working with. I have a professional organization. That's one of many professional organizations I've worked with, et cetera, et cetera. I've helped towns and cities. Got an invitation last night to make a presentation at the University of Canterbury in South New Zealand. You know, I don't travel now that the pandemic is around, but I've enjoyed my work presenting in places all over the world. Taught a couple of weeks in China, you know, Japan, throughout South America, and across the United States. So I love my work. This is my life's work over the last 50 years, and I'm happy to help any organization that thinks my services can be of use.
Yeah. Well, I think you have done some amazing work from what I've seen here in North Carolina and some of the other things I've watched with you. I think there are a few YouTube things of you as well. So, I mean, people can find you when I write. If you allow me to upload this video, I'll put all that you just said in there and make sure people know where to find you.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm very, very
sure.
grateful for this and I appreciate it. I just sent you a little message in the chat. So please look at the chat and I'll talk to you soon. Please stay safe and take very good care of yourself.
All right. You stay safe. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.